About 3 weeks later, my father, who's a fireman, was a fireman, went duck hunting with another fireman, and they were caught in a storm on Lake Erie unexpectedly and were drowned. And nothing was recovered for over a month later. No sign, no nothing. Until after about a month, my father's body came to rest on a Canadian shore, a place where he liked to vacation frequently. My education at home was good. I had good parents. However, the Bible was never there and never opened and never read. My church education, I was in a Protestant church, and I was very interested in what I heard, and I remember Vacation Bible School and the pictures, but there was a weakness. The Bible was very much missing. Young people, we recited and memorized creeds. That's mainly all we did. My public education, I went to a public high school. And we were taught evolution, macro and micro. Macroevolution in biology, and on top of that, icing on the cake, in humanities, we were taught existentialism and nihilism, and that life is meaningless in public school. My peers in high school, we were the psychedelic generation, the hippie generation. And the theme was expand your mind. It reminds me now, in hindsight, of Genesis 3:6, when Eve looked at the forbidden fruit and said, it's desirous of bringing on wisdom, making me wise. Deception. I decided that I didn't believe in God anymore when I was 15. I didn't believe the Bible because I didn't know much about it, and what I did hear about it, I couldn't understand. I said, I don't believe it. I left the church, which we used to go every Sunday to church, the family. I stopped going. My father was dead. My mother had to work. I was the oldest son. I had a younger brother. The pastor came to visit me in my room upstairs, the room my father built with knotty pine walls. And he sat across from me and talked to me. And at one point I told him, I feel I'm a good person. He left and he told my mother, it's too late. It's too late for him. My worldview. What was my worldview at that time when I was 16, sitting against that tree where I could think for myself? My worldview at that time was chance instead of creator, false science instead of true science, physical only instead of physical, mental, and spiritual, and self rather than God. That was my worldview. What is your worldview? What do you believe? The next tree in my life was a peach tree. I spent 20 years as an atheist from the time I was 15 to 35. At this time, I was driving a speedboat. My life was a speedboat, and I was at the helm, and I was steering and speeding around, deciding where I'd go and what I'd do, and all kind of different activities. And in hindsight, if I look behind my speedboat at the wake, in hindsight I see nothing but harm in my wake. Harm to myself and harm to all other people associated with me. During this 20 years of being an atheist, God intervened several times. He sent messengers to me several times, which I don't have time to go into in this short testimony. But each and every time, I rejected the attempt. Also, I'll have you know, I'm on borrowed time right now. There was at least 3 days where I easily should have been dead. 2 by huge explosions, and 1 by being run over by a car. 3 different days I should have been dead. I shouldn't be here. I'm on borrowed time. So God also, not only did he intervene, he prevented as well some tragedies, even though I didn't know him at that time. I was a New Age adventurer, exploring all different kinds of spiritualities, spiritualisms. I was here and I was there. I spent 2 years in one organization group, learning all kinds of metaphysical things. My life, in a certain way, has a parallel to Paul's life. Paul was on a road one day, Damascus Road, and he had an encounter, and it changed his worldview. It wasn't like he suddenly came up with a new worldview. He was confronted. The same thing happened to me. On Peachtree Road, hence the peach tree, in Atlanta has many streets called Peachtree, by the way, but there's one in particular where I was active and doing things and meeting with people, and I had a series over some period of months of irrefutable, dramatic confrontations with the supernatural, both of the dark side and of the light from God. And it stopped me in my tracks. I had to admit to myself that I was wrong, that God did exist. And it totally shattered my worldview, completely shattered it. I had to start over. Just like Paul, the scales fell from his eyes. The blinding scales fell from my eyes. And now, for the first time, I could see the world the correct way. Reminds me of the introductory comments of how some people want to only see the world through certain colored glasses. The next tree, the last tree, was the olive tree. The olive tree stands in the Bible for Israel, the Holy Spirit, and peace. I went to a local Protestant church, a different denomination than the one I grew up in, a big church, a lot of people, and it was a powerful sermon. And at the end of the sermon, they gave an invitation, and I walked down that aisle. I still can see myself walking down that aisle. I got up front, I turned around, faced the congregation. They're all singing this hymn. I'll never forget that moment. There was a few other people with me who came forward. There was a lot of room left for others. Don't ever forget, there's always room for one more at the foot of the cross. I went forward. I was a sinner in need of the Savior. I was an orphan in need of the family of God, spiritual Israel. I was baptized. I still remember visually the scene going under the water and coming up. I came up a new creation, born of the Holy Spirit, a brand plucked from the fire. It wasn't long after that, somebody at the church called me and asked me a question. They said, "Would you like to teach 7th grade boys Sunday school?" And I said, "What does a 7th grade boy look like?" And I did. I taught 7th grade boys Sunday school for 7 years at the same church. And so that's where I learned the basics of the Bible. I went back to 7th grade. I had a new worldview now. Worldview, by the way, is WV, not VW. During this time, there were some life changes, different places I lived, and I joined 2 different Protestant churches, different denominations, 4 in all over my lifespan. And what happened during this period is I was encountering some confusion. There was things I was being taught and I was seeing that to me seemed confusing, not how I saw the character of God. They distorted the character of God. I was respectful. I just tried to understand the best I could. One day, I'll just give you one example. There's more than one. But one day I had a talk with God. I said, "God, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm not going to be happy in heaven. I'm not going to be happy knowing that there's people burning forever and ever in fire." Well, God didn't say anything to me, but He answered that prayer. It wasn't long after that, I saw a flyer at a friend's house for a Bible prophecy seminar conducted by Ron Halverson Sr., an ex-gang member in New York City. I went to that seminar and found out that it went for a good part of the summer. It was many days and many weeks, and every night from the Bible, I learned that I didn't know everything I thought I knew. When you look at all what it has to say on a subject, the full scope and the context, that's the only way to look at the Bible. And so, my confusions got cleared up. I was no longer confused. I had clarity. And I joined, by profession of faith, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which I'm now a very happy family member of. It's important that we're all aware of the siege of Genesis, S-E-I-G-E, if I spelled it right, synonym for attack. In Genesis, we have the creation story. We have the true family, the true health message, and the Sabbath. Why is creation under attack? Because it's an attack on Genesis, which is the foundation of these important pillars of health. I want you to know that my testimony is not about me. Yes, it's my story, but the story's really not about me. The story is about God. Not only was God the creator, but guess what? He was the designer first. Then, he's been the sustainer since then. He's also the Redeemer, the Counselor, our Father, and the only rightful King of the universe. We are to respect God and give glory to Him who made everything. Thank you.
It's a privilege to welcome to the Southern Adventist University campus and to our Creation Celebration Conference a friend, someone whom I have been with at several conferences over the years. Dr. Ben Clausen has been with the Geoscience Research Institute for 35 years, and if you would look at his curriculum vitae, you would need to look at it very long before figuring out that this is a really smart man. He majored in physics and math at Union College, from which he graduated in 1978. And you would know already that those are probably two of the most challenging majors that exist on a university campus. He majored in both of those. He went on and earned a PhD in nuclear physics in 1987 from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has a long list of publications in experimental papers on stretched states. He has a number of papers in nuclear physics, and as I said, if you looked at the titles of some of these papers, you would conclude that this is a really smart man. And that is true, but what I want you to know even more is not only does he have a very insightful mind, but he has a committed heart. I've heard Dr. Clausen speak on several occasions, and he has a heart that is committed to the Lord, and he seeks God as a Christian scientist. It's a privilege to welcome him here to the Southern campus. Let's give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Ben Clausen.
Thank you for your kind introduction. It's always good to work with you. And it's always good to come to Southern Adventist University. It's just beautiful here. Flying into Atlanta, it's just so green. Here we come from the desert, and we have to take water from the Colorado River to get us a little bit of green here and there, but here the green is all over the place. So I love coming here. I'm not used to dressing up like this. I did physics for a while, and you don't dress up doing physics, but the last 20 years I've been doing geology, and you don't dress up to do geology either. You work out in the field, you wear your blue jeans or cutoffs or whatever, and you have a work vest, and you put all your paraphernalia in the vest and so forth. So this is a little bit out of character for me. Tonight and tomorrow, I'm going to be giving several talks. The one tonight is about my own personal journey, developing ways of relating science and religion. Tomorrow morning, I get to give one about Galileo and about what appeared to be a conflict, which didn't necessarily have to be, but it was, between science and religion. Then I'll talk a little bit about God's power in nature, the design that you see, the beauty that you see, from the size of the quark, the atom, out to the size of the universe, and God's power in the human heart. In the afternoon, I'll talk a little bit about time issues. I find that design issues point very nicely to a designer, a God who designed the beauty that we see. When I look at time, it's not necessarily quite as easy to see a short time, at least in the area that I'm doing research in. So how do I go about relating to that? And then tomorrow evening, I'll be talking a little bit about why does it even make a difference? I'm no theologian, but as I look at some of the theodicy issues, why is it that we see evil in the world when we serve a good God? That, to me, is one of the reasons that I find the time issue to be so important. And then I'd like to talk a little bit tomorrow evening about what do we have to share as Seventh-day Adventists. I and the group that I work with, the Hard Rock Geology Research Group at Loma Linda, has had many opportunities of working within the scientific community, finding ways of reaching out to them, and they enjoy working with us. They appreciate our data, they appreciate our approach, and they even expect us to have prayer together when we get together. And I found that there's ways to reach out to people that draws them in and doesn't push them away. So this evening, I'd like to talk a little bit about my own personal journey. And let me see if I can figure out how to work this. And I don't want to be standing right here in front of the picture, so I will try this. So I've entitled this, A Christian and a Scientist, Loving God's Word and Loving God's World. Now, about a year and a half ago, I got into doing Facebook stuff. And it's ended up that I'm a little bit addicted to it. And I like to post stuff pretty regularly on Facebook. And what I'm trying to do is point out this. What is the life of a scientist and a Christian like? How does somebody who loves God's Word and loves God's world, how do they live? And so I post a whole range of stuff of the type of things that I do. So if you're interested in some of that, you can friend me on Facebook. If you're really interested, kind of tell me who you are. I have some people asking to be friends that I think probably I'd do better not being friends with. So at least, if you're interested, at least tell me who you are. So I'll give a little bit of that this evening. So this is the Bible that I got when I was in grade school at a Bible contest in the Chesapeake Conference in Maryland. And the other one is Yosemite, lots of granitic rocks, very similar to the granitic rocks that we study in Peru. That's the main part of our research group study. Okay, so this is kind of the beginning. I need to keep track of time here so I don't end up talking too long. So okay. So I grew up a pastor's kid. When I was young, my parents would read to me from the Bible or the Bible stories and so forth. So I decided I should be able to do that myself. And so when I was about 7 years old, I wanted to tell my mom the story, and she typed it out. And so this is her typing, but it was me dictating to her what I wanted to have typed. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it'll give you an idea here. 60 centuries ago, Adam and Eve went out of their beautiful home. That means that they sinned. That's why they had to go out of their beautiful home. 40 centuries ago, there was a flood when all the people should be destroyed. Almost all of them. A few of them were good, and so forth. So this is what I was dictating when I was about 6 years old, and my mom was typing for me. So that was kind of where I came from. We'd read Uncle Arthur's Bible stories. My mom got me into reading the Conflict of the Ages series that goes through the Bible. I attended evangelistic meetings. I took a number of Bible correspondent lessons, Faith for Today, Voice of Prophecy, and so forth. And I got into doing Bible contests when I was in Maryland at Highland View Academy. But I was also very interested in science. My brother was about 11 years older than me, and he was into biology. So he got me into collecting butterflies. I made a flower collection when I was in high school. My brother got a chemistry lab kit for a Christmas present one year, an electronic lab kit, and so forth. So I enjoyed both the Bible part, both the religion part, as well as the science part. My very first year at Highland View Academy, when I was 13, we were supposed to write a paper, an Old Testament paper, for the first semester. And the topic I chose was evolution and creation. So I wrote a 9-page paper about it, and I still have the paper. And not too long ago, I looked through it again, and my ideas haven't changed an awful lot from when I was 13. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but I still have kind of the same approach to things. In college, I went to Union College. My dad moved from being a pastor in Maryland to being a pastor in Nebraska, so that's the reason I went there. I had a math and physics major, and while I was there was a conference about origins at Andrews University. And what I remember was there was a range of views that were presented at that conference. And people got very upset at each other if they had a different view. And that kind of gave me the background for thinking that there seems to be a real conflict between science and religion, or at least between people's views about science and religion. I went as a student missionary for a year to Seleuci College in Rhodesia, what's now Zimbabwe. I taught physics classes and math classes, and for some reason they decided I was supposed to teach a Bible class to these students. Here I was 19 years old, and I was teaching a Bible class to 16-year-old people there in Africa. And the title of the class was Facing Life. So here's a 19-year-old. I was supposed to be teaching 16-year-olds how to face life. Well, I guess I learned some stuff in the process, but it was a good experience. And before I left, I told them, you have some fascinating geology here, and someday I'm going to come back and explain this geology to you. And in about 2015, my wife and I went back to both Zimbabwe and Zambia and gave a number of lectures, including talking about the local geology and leading a field trip to the Matopos, where this picture on the left-hand side was taken. And we're doing some research, some geology research in Zambia, just north of Zimbabwe, and I'll be leading a geology field conference in northern Tanzania at the end of this year, looking at the geology of the Rift Valley, the Serengeti, the Lake Victoria area, and so forth. So looking at the geology, talking about it with the teachers there in the East Central Africa Division, and trying to understand God's creation and how do we understand it in light of what the Bible has to say. So I taught high school a couple years, and then I decided I'd like to get a master's degree in geology. So I went to Loma Linda, and the project we had was making a geologic map of a valley in Nevada, looking at what used to be a lake, sediments deposited in the lake. After the lake dried up, you had a whole sequence of sediments there. And how does one go about understanding that sequence of sediments? However, I came from a very quantitative background, and this geology was very descriptive. So I got a little bit disillusioned with it, that you were just describing things and you couldn't actually put numbers to it. So I quit the geology for a while. I went into nuclear physics. I figured I'm interested in time issues. I'm interested in radiometric dating. Are there some ways of understanding radiometric dating and time issues in a short time frame instead of a long time frame? So I applied to about 6 different universities, got accepted into most of them, but I decided I'd go to University of Colorado because it was right close to the Continental Divide. It was in the Rocky Mountains, and I could enjoy going around hiking on weekends when I wasn't studying the nuclear physics. So we worked at several accelerators, primarily at Los Alamos. This is the area where the atomic bomb was built during the Second World War. And when they ran, when the machine was running, it would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I would ask to have Sabbaths off. And my professor went out of his way to make sure that that was not a problem. In fact, we had a rental car, and he'd say, you can take the rental car and go to church on Sabbath, no problem at all. However, because of that, people would ask me, so what do Seventh-day Adventists believe? And, you know, as I grew up, I'd taken Bible doctrines and so forth, so I'd list a bunch of doctrines, and so they would listen politely, and that was kind of the end of the conversation. So since then, I've tried to figure out ways that might engage people and get them interested rather than just having their eyes glaze over. So tomorrow night, I'll talk a little bit about that. As I was finishing up my PhD, I was writing about all these fancy equations to describe the experiments we were doing. And one day I got tired of that, and I decided I'd write the acknowledgments. And so I thank my parents for giving me a good start in life. And I thank my wife for putting up with a perpetual student for a husband. And I thank my daughter, who was 3 at the time, for keeping me excited about learning. And then I thought, well, I'll put in something about thanking God for a fascinating creation that He's made for us to study. And so this was in the acknowledgments in my dissertation. And I'm not sure whether much of anybody ever read it, but a few years later there was one person that asked me a little bit about it, and she said, I go to the nuclear physics library and I look at all the dissertations and I don't understand what any of them are saying, but I look at the acknowledgments, and so I happened to look at your acknowledgment, and it was specifically said that you thanked God for making a fascinating world. So at least there was one person that read it. When I was finished there, I spent 2 years at University of Virginia in the nuclear physics program there. And we did research at MIT at their electron accelerator and also in the electron accelerator in Amsterdam. But then at the same time, I was an elder in the little church in Charlottesville and taught the Sabbath school lesson every week. So it kind of felt like I was in 2 different worlds at the same time. Again, giving me experiences, how do I relate science and faith? How do I both be a scientist of integrity as well as a person of faith, a believer in God who created the world for us to study? As was mentioned, for the last 35 years, I've been at the Geoscience Research Institute doing all kinds of various things, organizing conferences, writing articles, co-authored a book, teaching classes. The one in the lower right is in the Philippines, where I taught at the Adventist University near Manila. And on one of our field trips, we went to see the inside of a volcano, where they have the largest island in a lake, in an island, in a lake, in an island in the world, the Taal volcano. Fascinating place. And so here we are on the inner lake, on the edge of the inner lake, looking at the steam coming up from the fumaroles there. And I've agreed to go back and teach that class again, not this summer, but next summer as well. So hopefully we'll get to do a field trip there again. So, part of what I do at Geoscience is research. And a few years ago, there was a conference in St. George, Utah, where science and religion topics were discussed. And Elder Mike Ryan was one of the people there. He gave a presentation on Sabbath, and as part of it he said, Adventist schools are called to become global scientific leaders. And then the subtitle is, Michael Ryan, a vice president of the Adventist World Church, tells educators that the secret is to remain faithful like Moses and Daniel. So this was an article that was written up in the Adventist Review. And I must say that the church has been extremely supportive of the research that our hard rock geology group has been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. So these are some of the places. Actually, this is a little bit of an old slide. I just have 2 red dots there, Southern California and Peru, but we're also doing research in other places in Mexico. We've started working in Hawaii, and we're hoping next year that we'll start a program in the Galapagos also to look at the volcanic rocks there. So those are the red dots. The black dots are areas where I have led geology field conferences or geology field trips to look at the geology in different places. Our understanding of Genesis is that there was a worldwide catastrophe, and it seems that we need to be looking at worldwide events, worldwide geological events, to understand it. So that's part of the reason for looking at this around the world. A number of other places where they've asked us to go and give lectures, I have told people about the local geology. Those are the white dots. And I also have blue dots on more recent maps than this in places that I've also gone on field trips where I haven't led out, but I've learned about areas as well. So I think it's important that as we're doing the geology research, we look at the worldwide picture. We may need to look at local areas, but we need to fit them into a worldwide picture. So, why is it that I prefer a short age model? And I would suggest that it's an integral part of our name as Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh day, refers back to a recent creation, a recent 7-day creation, and Adventist refers to a short future until the second coming. So a short past since evil started, and a short future until it's over. And I see this as very important. I'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow night, that I believe God doesn't want the bad stuff to last any longer than necessary. I don't know whether I should tell you this tonight or tomorrow night. I'll just briefly mention. What would it be like to have an operation before there was anesthesia? What kind of a doctor would you want? Somebody who'd do it as quick as possible. And I think it's the same with the bad stuff. We want it over as quickly as possible. You remember the souls under the altar in Revelation 6 said, "How long, O Lord? How long until it's over?" So that's the reason that I prefer the short chronology model. However, it doesn't necessarily often turn out that way as I'm doing research. Our group is looking at plate tectonics, the geologic column, and radiometric dating. And it would be nice if the origin story were very easily confirmed by science. We have teachings about health, for example, tobacco and diet and so forth, and they seem to be very easily confirmed. But in my particular area of science, it's not quite so easy. It's a little bit more of a struggle to fit things into a short time frame. I'm not quite sure why, but here is one suggestion. Perhaps it's because origins has to do with one-time events rather than ongoing processes. Since they're one-time events, maybe it's hard to use science to reproduce or to understand what those one-time events are. So, what do I do with that kind of a disappointment? Philip Yancey has written a book, Disappointment with God. There's examples of people in the Bible who were disappointed. Naaman expected to be healed in a certain way, and he was disappointed. Now, as it turned out, in the end, the story turned out that he was healed. But he expected it in a certain way, and it didn't happen quite that way. Habakkuk, you find that he expected God to work in a certain way, and God didn't work in quite the way he expected. John the Baptist expected the Messiah to do a certain thing, and Jesus didn't do that. So he sent his disciples and asked Jesus, "Are you the one that's to come, or should we look for someone else?" Jesus shared some insights with John the Baptist's disciples about how he worked, and it satisfied John the Baptist. Unfortunately, it didn't satisfy the Jewish leaders. And even Jesus on the cross, you notice that he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So one could even say that Jesus was disappointed on the cross. So how do you go about dealing with that kind of disappointment? So I've outlined a way for dealing with that. My world picture has changed. I accept science for what it can do, but recognize that there's more. There are physics certainties, but there's also physics uncertainties, and I found many uncertainties in geology. What seemed to be a very well understood childhood God has become to me a God who is far beyond my understanding. I can understand a little bit, but it's far beyond anything I can study now or expect I'll be able to study in the future. And there's much to unlearn and much to learn, the need to grow in grace. So maybe science and religion is not your particular issue, but perhaps you're disappointed that God doesn't work quite the way that you're expecting. So, I have some suggestions here of how to deal with that if things don't turn out quite the way you expect. First, number one is the inspired record. That's what I put first. Second, I look at the natural world, the experiences of sense, try to understand them. I hope that I can get harmony. Often I do, but sometimes I don't. And so number three is looking for that harmony. And finally, number four, how do I treat people in the process of looking? So actually, I take a very conservative understanding of the Bible myself, probably more conservative than some of the people I work with. I'm rather flexible on that, but I find that the most consistent reading of Scripture for me is that God is the creator of everything, and he did it in 6 days. So, I'll give a little bit more details of each of these 4 points. Number one, the inspired record. Let's see how I'm doing for time here. Okay. God, as the creator, described in the Bible, is beyond human wisdom. Our human understanding is limited. Many answers are not available. So when I was a kid, I was part of Pathfinders, and we did progressive classwork and so forth. And one year we were supposed to memorize the 10 Commandments. And I don't like memorizing very well. That's the reason I went into physics. You don't have to memorize very much. You can always derive something if you've forgotten it. So physics is a lot easier than some of the other stuff where you have to memorize all this long stuff. So as I was memorizing the 10 Commandments, I didn't like the second commandment very well because it's really long. And to me, at that point, it seemed to me like it was saying the same thing as the first commandment. Well, just don't worship idols. Since then, I've come to realize the second commandment isn't saying the same thing as the first. It's related, but it's not quite the same. The first commandment says, "Thou shalt not have other gods before me." The second commandment says, even if you are worshiping the true God, don't worship small pictures, small images, small idols of how great God is. And if you look in Deuteronomy, it specifically says, God says, you didn't see what I was like, so don't try to make an image of me. And that's one of the reasons that the Jews did and still don't have these images to try to represent God, because you can't represent God by some kind of a picture. A good example of this is in J.B. Phillips' book, Your God is Too Small. One of the chapters there, it gives about a dozen different examples of too small a picture of God. But one of them is the grand old man. So you can imagine God or Jesus being an old man who knows about farming and fishing, like it talks about in the New Testament. But can you imagine God or Jesus sitting down at a computer and knowing how it works? Can you imagine him flying a jet aircraft? To begin with, you're not quite sure how that fits, but obviously he knows way more about that than we do. So it's easy to have too small a picture of God. I find in the book Desire of Ages, it says God has 1,000 ways to do things of which we know nothing. So this is one of the things I keep in mind as I am studying the geologic record, that often I have a hard time fitting into a short time frame, that God has 1,000 ways to do things that we don't know anything about. So as far as the theology part is concerned, the three angels' messages are specifically talking about the creation. The good news of restoration. There was a perfect creation in the past, and we can look forward to a perfect creation in the future. And there'll be justice and judgment for all. Second angel's message is about the fallenness and limitations of human wisdom, whether Babylon, the church, science, or me myself, my own limitations, that I can't figure everything else. And the third one, the Sabbath is a symbol that we worship the Creator rather than the creature. And so here that you can see the Sabbath is a symbol of worshiping the Creator. It's a symbol that God is the Lord of time, as He's Lord of everything else. It's a symbol that God is a personal God who set aside a time to be with us. It's a symbol that God is wiser than we are. So, I worship God on the seventh day, even if I don't necessarily understand exactly how or what God created during those 7 days. And lastly, the Sabbath is a symbol that we can rest from our worry. And for me, from trying to explain the creation and the flood scientifically in all its different forms. Unfortunately, often on Sabbath, I'm supposed to give lectures about this stuff, and often it's not very restful. So when I'm at home with my wife, often I try to do different stuff than talk about origins issues. Okay, the second part. What about nature? And for me, I'm fascinated by physics and geology, the complexity, and science can do some absolutely fabulous stuff. I've worked on particle accelerators that are a mile long. I've worked on mass spectrometers, radiometric dating, and so forth, and I'm amazed at the kind of stuff we can come up with. But I also realize that there's need for something more than just what science can do. And I've given some examples here. From math, there's the incompleteness theorem. I give a talk about the new physics, where in general science, you expect determinism, objectivity, and reductionism. However, in the new physics, quantum mechanics, relativity, and so forth, you lose some of those fundamentals of science just a little bit. Talking about the Big Bang is currently the best model of how the universe started off. It's not perfect, and there's lots of questions about it. So there's limitations as well as it being impressive. Design for life, I could give you examples of how the constants of nature seem to be specifically fine-tuned to make life possible. So those first four I know just a little bit about. The remainder are in biology, and I'm sorry I don't know much at all about those. The origin of life from a, quotes, simple cell. To me, as an amateur, it seems like there's no way you can get that kind of complexity purely by chance. Complex design and the Cambrian explosion or gaps in the fossil record. And finally, how do you get a conscious mind by random processes? So, one of the examples, I need to have somebody telling me when I'm supposed to stop here. How much more time do I have? Like about 5 minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, I'll try to speed up here. Actually, the idea of an expanding universe was developed in about 1930 based on observations from a telescope there in Southern California, that it seemed like the further away the galaxies were, the faster they were moving away from us. That suggested that at some point in the past they were all together. So Edwin Hubble suggested an expanding universe. However, scientists didn't like it very well for philosophical reasons, and it was rejected for about 30 years. And the reason it was rejected was because it pointed back to a beginning of the universe, and if there's a beginning, there needs to be a beginner. And who would that beginner be but God? So the Big Bang seemed to point back to the need for God to start things off. In the 1960s, they found new evidence for the Big Bang, and now it's become the accepted theory, but it still seems to point back to a beginning and a beginner. It seems to point to some kind of a designer, some kind of a God. And so that's what this quote at the end of this book by Robert Jastrow is talking about. It says, as scientists climbed the mountain of knowledge, they got to the top. They went further and further back in time, and when they got back to the beginning, what did they find at that top of that mountain of knowledge? They were greeted by a band of theologians who had been sitting there for centuries. So, I guess that was the disappointment for them. They didn't like that idea very well, that this Big Bang pointed back to God as the beginner. Okay, the third point, how do you relate science and religion? In the book Education, Mrs. White says, the book of nature and the book of Revelation cannot but speak in harmony. They shed light on each other, and they make us acquainted with God. So, you expect there to be agreement. Interestingly, modern science developed within a Judeo-Christian framework. And here are some reasons why. The Judeo-Christian God is a personal God who is separate from nature. If you worship some kind of animistic gods, gods who are part of nature, you'd be kind of afraid of doing experiments on nature because you're doing experiments on your God, and that isn't being very worshipful for your God. So that would be one reason why modern science developed where God is separate from nature. Second, the God of the Bible is a God of law and order. He's not a capricious God. So if he's a God of law and order as outlined in the Bible, you would expect that maybe he works with laws in an orderly universe as well. Third, as you read the creation story, you find that God created matter and pronounced it good. So it would be worthy of study. And this would be in contrast with, for example, Greek philosophy that suggested it's the ideas that are good and the physical substances are only a poor representation of that ideal. And so the Greeks did some experimenting on nature, but not too much. Mainly they were just philosophers and they didn't like to get their hands dirty. Some did, but in general, that wasn't the way they approached it so much. So that's several of the reasons that modern science actually developed within a Judeo-Christian framework. Many of the founding fathers of science were Christians. Isaac Newton, I have a whole talk that I give with examples of how Newton and Boyle and Linnaeus and Pascal and Faraday were Christians as well as leading scientists. However, there are some difficulties in that relationship, and one needs to be careful in not forcing there to be harmony where perhaps your particular interpretation of the harmony is not correct. So as a result, for me, coherence is not my first priority. It comes in at about number 3. My first priority is, what does the Bible have to say? A second priority is trying to understand what nature has to say. And then my third priority is trying to find the relation between the two. So sometimes, just in theology, there are paradoxes. How is it possible that God knows the end from the beginning? He knows what I'm going to do in the future, but yet I have free will at the same time. Another example is, how is it possible that Jesus is both creator and created at the same time? And that's been discussed for several thousand years. How do you deal with those paradoxes? And we have paradoxes in science too. In physics, how is it possible that light is both a wave and a particle at the same time? So, some examples where the Bible talks about that. Isaiah 55, God says, my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. In John 16, Jesus said, I have many things that I would like to say to you, but you can't bear them now, and so forth. So I would suggest that reality is more than just the scientific model of the reality. So a couple examples here. You've probably seen the example of the 6 blind men and the elephant. So the elephant is the reality, but the blind men have various models, limited models of that reality. One touches the tail and said the elephant is like a rope. Another touches the leg and says the elephant is like a tree. Another touches the side and says the elephant is like a wall, and so forth. So they have their own models of the reality, but the reality is much bigger than any of those models. And then this other one, the optical illusion. There are two different pictures in this, and you've probably seen this. There's both an old lady and a young lady here. How many of you can see that? Okay, yeah, most of you can. I think if you have trouble with it, those are the two different ones that kind of help you see the two different models. So it's possible to look at one thing in the world and have different interpretations of it. So the reality is more than any one particular scientific model than we can develop for it. Okay, so there's a place for evidence and reason. I like it. I'm a scientist. But I've learned that there's something more than that. So I like to tell this story. My wife doesn't necessarily like it real well, but she's heard me tell it a few times. I went as a student missionary to Africa. I already told you that. When I came back, I decided it was time to get married. And I decided that I would use the scientific method to find a young lady to get married to. I would use evidence and reason. And so back then, we had great big sheets of computer paper. And so on this big sheet of computer paper, I made a list along the side of the qualities that I was looking for in a wife. And then I went to the college funny book and selected names of eligible young ladies and put those along the top. And then I filled it in like a spreadsheet. If I did it today, I'd use an Excel spreadsheet and fill it in and decide who was the ideal wife. So I went through, selected who the perfect one was, asked her on some dates, and she said yes. And I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. And we've been married for 45 years. So the scientific method works well in selecting a wife. However, I have learned over the years that more than evidence and reason is necessary. And my wife has taught me a lot about that over the last 45 years. And I find the same is true as I look at science, as I'm trying to understand physics or geology or the other sciences. There's a definite place for evidence and reason, but there's also need for something more than just evidence and reason. Kierkegaard talks about reason plus a leap of faith. Chesterton says one can only find truth with logic if he has already found truth without it. And Anselm talks about faith seeking understanding. John 14 suggests that truth is more a person than a set of facts, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So he is the truth, a person is the truth, not just a set of facts. Finally, how do we deal with people in the process? Unfortunately, I so often see the antagonism between science and religion, and I don't believe that has to be there. We have made friends with many in the geology community who we could antagonize, but we're not out to antagonize, we're out to find ways of drawing them in. So I have several quotations from Christ Object Lessons, Desire of Ages, Ministry of Healing, and so forth. One summary that I found helpful is in a book that my daughter recommended to me. She was a literature professor at Walla Walla University for a number of years. This is from Madeline L'Engle. The quotation is, we draw people to Christ not by loudly discrediting what they believe, by telling them how wrong they are and how right we are, but by showing them a light that is so lovely that they want with all their hearts to know the source of it. So there may be a place to go out and pointing out wrong in others, but perhaps there's an even bigger place for finding ways of drawing them in, to pointing to something better, to say, not so much you're wrong, as to say, this is the way that you can live that's so much better in recognizing a God who loves you. So, my message is to offer a Christ-like God, a better picture of the Creator, a powerful Creator who can do things humans can't explain, and a good Creator who's trustworthy in the face of evil, suggesting the need for something more. There's a place for evidence and reason, place for revelation and tradition, and a way to lead to a reasonable faith. A place for freedom and curiosity and learning that's not static. That there is purpose and meaning in life. The world is here for a reason. There's goodness, and there's not hopeless evil just by chance. The evil needs fixing, and we can look forward to a happy ending. Number 3, to recognize our own limitations. And number 4, to present a good and caring community in the face of evil and failure. And I believe that that's what we do with our scientific colleagues to draw them in. They like working with us. They want to come and be part of our research group. And that makes all the difference.
Thank you very much to Dr. King and also the musicians and Derek and Dr. Clausen. They gave us many wonderful insights about science and religion and how to struggle and how to believe and trust and have reason at the same time. Just very briefly, I'm going to share a couple things, and then we're going to watch a little bit of a video by some top scientists that has some very powerful ideas also. But the Bible gives us powerful evidence of God. And like Paul could go to Athens in Acts 17 and he could say, we have strong, good reasons to believe in the Creator. And 1/3 of his talk was about creation there in Acts 17. But he also said he proved the resurrection to the Athenians, a pagan people. At the same time, there is also evidence for the enemy of God. You see in the Bible, the Egyptians had the miracles, quote, miracles. And some people, they looked good at first sometimes. But God's miracles were stronger. So you have this wrestling of evidence on both sides. The Bible also talks about pleasures of sin for a season. But the big issue is, where is the majority of evidence that does the most good and aligns with reality the best? And the Bible predicts that there will be deliberate deceptions, especially about creation and the flood in 2 Peter 3. And so we need to be aware of that. And Dr. King in the beginning talked about how some scientists will not allow a divine foot in the door. And that's very, very common. The technical term for that is methodological naturalism. And that's one key also, that when you see someone has a presupposition, they decide the end before checking evidence, that's a good idea to not trust their conclusions. It's kind of like playing a sports game, but the winner is decided before you even play the game. And so that's a very big issue. So we're going to look here at a very short video, only about 15 minutes or so, and it shows some of the key issues where leading scientists, there's Dr. Stephen Meyer, he's got a PhD from Cambridge, there's Dr. James Tour, he's one of the top 5 chemists in the world. They're showing how the science is pointing more and more strongly to God and creation in many ways. And so I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from what they say also, as you have from the other speakers before.
We are? Is that what we are? Or is it just a mask some scientists want us to wear?
The origin of life community has not been honest.
Materialists understand that materialism cannot explain the mind.
Who am I?
Rather than abandoning materialism, they abandon the mind.
Our planet has water and carbon, both necessary for life. So the Earth is exceedingly rare.
You get many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made.
We come one way. How to spin it, we'll show you the way. How to do it. There exists a code so complex and advanced that it defies the probability of chance.
When we see information in software and we trace that information back to its source,
How to spin it, we'll show you the way.
we always come to a mind that's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us, that information always arises from an intelligent source.
The life we have on Earth must have spontaneously generated itself.
Scientists have reason to think that the first living cells on Earth came about through a natural process called chemical evolution. First living cell chemical evolution.
Life spontaneously generated itself.
Did life really spontaneously generate itself from chemicals? Has science shown this? We tracked down James Tour, one of the world's leading experts in synthetic organic chemistry, to find out.
All of these little pictures of molecules coming together to form the first cell are fallacious, are ridiculous. The origin of life community has not been honest. They will write in their very papers, they will see some small phenomena and extrapolate what this means in the context of origin of life. And then they will work with the press, and the press will extrapolate it all the more. And you get many, many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made. All of this is a lie.
Scientist Craig Venter creates life for the first time in a laboratory.
We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell.
We haven't created life, nowhere close. What they did is they took a cell. They took the genome out of that cell. They manufactured a genome that's similar to it, and they put it in. That is akin to taking an engine out of a Ford and putting it into a Buick and then saying, look, I created automobiles. No, you just took one piece, and it's not even the engine. It's just the computer control box you took out of one car and you put it in another car. That's what it was like. But the design of the computer control box you got from other cells.
Other scientists say they've been able to create protocells in the lab that are the stepping stones to the first life.
I can mix some chemicals together in a test tube in my lab, and these chemicals will start to self-associate to form larger and larger structures. The protocell moves as a metabolism. It could use energy and it moves around.
Protocells are a bunch of nonsense. That is like a proto-turkey. I take 20 pounds of sliced turkey meat from a delicatessen. I throw that into a pot. I add some turkey broth. I warm that up, and I throw in some feathers, and I say, that's a proto-turkey. Yeah, there's no order to it, but you know, if you wait long enough, a turkey will come gobbling out. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? That's precisely what origin of life researchers have done when they make a protocell.
Wait a second. Haven't we been taught with hundreds of millions of years anything is possible?
Time is actually the enemy. You let these chemicals that have been made sit around. They show the degradation in a period of weeks. Weeks is the twinkling of an eye when it comes to prebiotic timescales. The chemicals decompose. So to think that the molecules could be made and sit there waiting for other molecules to come in, it doesn't happen. Organic chemistry doesn't work that way.
Well, if life didn't spontaneously generate on Earth, what about scientists who believe that life must have come here from outer space?
Whether you want to have it originate from Earth or from some other planet, you have to have the origin of life. You have to have the origin of that first cell. How does that happen? We have no idea.
So with all the advances in scientific research and the study of life, why can't we figure this out?
With all of origin of life research going on, the problem is becoming harder all the time, not easier. And the reason it's become harder is because we understand more about the complexity of a cell.
To help explain the complexity of living cells, we turn to molecular biologist Douglas Axe.
To get an idea of the complexity of a living cell, think of a factory with thousands of pieces of machinery all working together to do some coordinated task. A cell is actually far more complicated than that factory because factories don't maintain themselves. People have to maintain factories, and factories certainly don't make new factories. Whereas with a living cell, all the parts that wear out are automatically remanufactured within the cell. Not only that, the cell is manufacturing a new cell as well. Human-made factories don't even come close.
For a living cell to exist and perform such complex tasks, it takes some very detailed instructions, which are chemically encoded in our DNA.
If you have a string of nucleic acids like DNA or RNA has. You have to have a precise sequence because that translates to what proteins are needed to build the organism. That's called the information code.
But where did all that information, these detailed instructions, come from to build the first cell?
We don't have a tool to assess that within chemistry.
Laboratory chemistry may not, but Stephen Meyer is convinced origin science does have the tools.
Is there anything we know of that does have the causal power, the ability to generate new information, and therefore could explain the origin of the first cell? And I think there is, and that's the idea of intelligent design.
Intelligent design is defined as the theory that certain features of the natural world are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process.
Because what we know from our experience is that intelligent agents can produce information, and indeed do produce information in a digital or typographic form, the form of information that we find in the DNA molecule, functional digital information. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we find it in a section of software code or a paragraph in a book or in a hieroglyphic inscription, we always find that a mind played a role in generating that information.
Don't be fooled by the hype. Materialists are further from explaining the origin of life than ever before, yet they still refuse to consider the only observable source known to create information code, an intelligent designing mind. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
The DNA code itself is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Totally interchangeable.
DNA code itself
is the software of life.
So digital.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, you know, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a program? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule. If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really? If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, and our DNA code can produce new organisms? Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 Or this?
fossils provide really good evidence for evolution.
Yeah, that's what I was taught in school too. But is the fossil record really good evidence for evolution? I asked Dr. Gunter Beckley, a fossil expert. He has discovered 180 new species in the fossil record and published over 160 scientific papers.
It is often believed that the fossil record is great support for Darwin's theory. Actually, this is not the case at all. The theory predicts slow changes, but the fossil record shows rapid changes. The theory predicts that new forms accumulate by addition of little small steps, but the fossil record shows they appear out of nothing suddenly.
Let's start with the most famous sudden appearance of life forms in geologic history, the Cambrian explosion. Geologist Casey Luskin explains.
Nearly all of the major living animal phyla appear abruptly in the Cambrian period in a geological eye blink, a 5 to 10 million year window. In the Cambrian explosion, we see many diverse body plans appear without any direct evolutionary precursors. In fact, one invertebrate zoology textbook says that the animal phyla appear fully formed, such that the fossil record is of no help to understanding how these species and these diverse body plans arose.
But is the Cambrian explosion the exception? Because we usually hear,
the fossil record clearly demonstrates that organisms don't suddenly appear.
The phenomenon of sudden appearances in the fossil record is not just an exceptional case, but actually is a pattern that is found everywhere. The origin of life, the origin of photosynthesis, the Avalon explosion, the great Ordovician biodiversification event, the Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution, the Devonian-Nekton revolution, and the Odontode revolution, the Carboniferous insect explosion, the Triassic explosions, the origin of flowering plants, the origin of butterflies, the Neo-Avian revolution of modern birds, the placental mammal radiation, the origin of the genus Homo, and finally the Upper Paleolithic human revolution.
Now that is a serious list of big jumps in the fossil record.
If you look at the technical literature, we can see references to a fish explosion, a bird explosion, a dinosaur explosion, a mammal explosion, and even the origin of our own genus Homo has been referred to as a Big Bang theory of human evolution, because we see throughout the fossil record different types of organisms appearing abruptly without this gradual change that Darwin's theory predicted.
In the middle of the Carboniferous period, we find the first flying insects. And the striking thing is there are no fossil precursors for them. There are no credible transitions. Just presto, this fully articulated marvels.
Just how bad is the fossil record for Darwin's theory? Anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz, who supports evolution, is blunt. Most major groups of organisms, he says, appear in the fossil record, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution. Some scientists say the transitions in the fossil record just look abrupt, and that we'll find the gradual transitions if we just keep on digging. Beckley thinks that explanation is no longer credible.
And here's why. Imagine you have a new hobby and you walk along the beach and you collect starfish and shells and snails. Every day you find something new, but over time, repetition sets in. And ultimately you reach a day where you only find over and over again what you already found. And then you know that you have sampled enough to know what is out there. Exactly this method is applied in paleontology to statistically test the completeness of the fossil record. It's called the collector's curve. In most groups of organisms, we know that the fossil record is sufficiently complete to be sure that the gaps that we see are not artifacts of undersampling or of an incomplete fossil record, but are actually data to be explained.
Some evolutionists basically admit that the many expected transitional fossils don't actually exist. They argue that the fossil record simply didn't have enough time to record the transitions. That was the view of two leading evolutionists who proposed a theory called punctuated equilibrium,
which said that basically species change so abruptly they don't have enough time to leave any transitional forms, and that was how they accounted for the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record.
But punctuated equilibrium has a problem. If major transitions really took place too quickly to be captured by the fossil record, there would be even less time available for genetic copying errors to accumulate into beneficial features, and evolutionary theory already faces a huge time crunch.
When we do mathematical calculations using standard textbook methods of population genetics. There simply is not enough time in the fossil record for random mutation and natural selection to produce the changes that we observe.
Scientists have been studying the fossil record for hundreds of years, and the evidence is now clear. If we just take off our materialist glasses and look, living things full of function, purpose, and design do not just appear by accident. A mind played a role in the creation of new forms of life, including you and me. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
I want to thank scienceuprising.com for that. They gave permission to show that and share that with you. You can go there and see many other examples and many other short things like that that are helpful. But yes, there are some challenges for sure, some very difficult ones. But if we didn't have challenges, we would not have a way to use our mind and to challenge ourselves very much. So it's a good way to study more. And so if you look at the majority of evidence, good evidence, there's a whole lot of evidence for creation that we can be very thankful for. And so right now we're going to have a closing prayer by Gary, and then a little break, and then there's 2 more talks also.
May we bow our heads, please? Kind Heavenly Father, we thank you for being for such an awesome God and creating the universe in 6 short days. We fully believe that it happened in that period of time. And the evidence is out there, Lord. It's for us to see, just to take a look at. You have it all over the universe, showing how that there is intelligent design. And it's because of that fact that we choose to worship you, Lord. Not because you are the great creator, but because you love us. And you loved us enough to send the Lord Jesus down. Even before the time began, you knew that we would sin and that you would have to send your son down to sacrifice himself for us, Lord. And we thank you so very much for that, Lord. And we just thank you for all the creative things that you've done in our lives, and help us and bless us every day. And we thank you and praise you for all your help. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, now we're going to have like about a 10-minute break. You can, there's some booths out there, and there's also restrooms and water and a little food if you want. And then we have Dr. Phyllis Saint coming back for talking about a mental health crisis and God's way to heal trauma at 8 o'clock, okay? So I hope you come back at 8 o'clock.